Alrighty, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's joint webinar between ISACA New England, ISACA Hartford, ISC Squared of Eastern Mass, and Wolf and Company PC, called The Importance of Proactive Vendor Due Diligence to Better Manage Risk. This webinar is worth one CPE, and in order to ensure timely and accurate crediting of CPs, please ensure your full name is set as your display name. You can do that by hovering over your video box. In the top of the right, there's a 3-dot ellipsis and click rename. As we go throughout the presentation, I might chat folks directly where I don't see the full name to ensure that I have it jotted down. And once again, you get those valuable CPEs. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please continue to use the Q&A feature like some of you folks have already done. But if you have a question that you'd like feedback from the broader group, feel free to use the broader chat function. We found that in past presentations, there was value in different folks sharing a dialogue throughout the meeting, but I'll ensure to keep Ryan honest, who has visibility into the Q&A as well, and really try to answer your folks' questions in real time to make sure it's as much of a dialogue as possible. We'll aim to complete the presentation around 12:50 or so and allow 10 minutes for Q&A. But like I said, we'll try to answer relevant questions in real time. And lastly, at the end, we'll be sharing a survey link via Google. If you could kindly click and provide any and all feedback so we can make sure to incorporate any adjustments in the future as well. A recording of the meeting will be made available through Wolf & Company's YouTube page, and we'll make sure to send a link to that shortly thereafter the presentation and the materials as well. Other than that, in terms of an introduction, I have Ryan Rodrigue with us today, and Ryan's a principal in Wolf's advisory group and the director of the firm's information technology audit team. He provides guidance on IT controls, information security and privacy, cybersecurity, and the implementation of effective risk management programs. He also ensures the quality delivery of innovative IT audit and consulting services. So without further ado, Ryan, turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Todd, and thank you for all the attendees for joining. As you mentioned, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, but feel free to ping me throughout the presentation if anything arises. I'll try and keep my eye on the chat window as we go. As Todd mentioned, I've been with Wolf for almost 20 years now. I lead our information security and IT advisory practice. That spans a pretty broad range of services. It's everything from SOX auditing to pure cybersecurity penetration testing and everything in between. But one common thread that we see with many of our clients, big and small, is a challenge around third-party risk management. So we've taken a lot of time today to talk about what are some of the risks and threats that we see happening out there, what are some of the practical issues that many folks are dealing with, and what are our recommendations for basically the fundamental building blocks to make a program that works for you, regardless of whether you're a large organization with a mature risk program or a smaller organization just getting started. Now, we're going to put some of those building blocks, we're going to put some of those lessons learned out there, and we're going to talk a little bit more as well about some lessons learned, let's say, some common pitfalls that we've seen out there with a special focus on this new space of, I'm calling them tech innovators for the purpose of today's discussion. These may be smaller SaaS startup type of companies. These may be boundary pushing fintech organizations. They may be anyone that doesn't fit into the traditional scope of a mature risk management program or the types of due diligence tasks that you tend to put out. They might not have a PCI certification or a SOC report available. And how do you handle those types of organizations as vendors as well? So we're going to be talking about all of that today. Throughout the presentation, you may hear me going back and forth between vendor and third party, and I apologize for that in advance, but we're going to try to use the term third party because it can be more than just vendors, right? Anyone that you're working with, sharing information with, sharing operations with could be a key third party for you. So without further ado, let's jump into it. We're going to talk a little bit at first about a couple of examples and a couple of things that these third party relationships mean to you right up front. A couple of things that I did a little bit of research. I looked at some examples that would be relevant for today. I want to point you to a couple that I think might resonate with some of you folks today. One of them that was a fairly big deal that you may be very familiar with was a couple of years ago, Kaseya, which is a pretty large, basically an endpoint management system. Many organizations around the world were using Kaseya to manage their endpoints. And what happened was there was a 0-day vulnerability that hackers were able to expose in Kaseya's software. Now, Kaseya was installed in on-prem environments. It was installed as a software as a service, but it ended up having thousands of organizations that were affected, about 1,500 total organizations that were affected through the various installations. Through that, the companies who trusted Kaseya to keep their endpoints safe suddenly had an exposure on their own systems. The endpoints that they owned and operated that had the Kaseya software on it were suddenly vulnerable to this attack, which resulted in a ransomware payload. So about $70 million worth of ransomware was demanded through this. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that much of that was paid out, but still, it was a very big deal for many of these companies, particularly those who didn't have their own strong risk management program in-house. There was about a week where Kaseya themselves were down, therefore not servicing the types of security programs that their clients expected them to service. Even the on-prem solutions were advised to be shut down until a patch was released at a later time. During that time, we weren't able to operate as businesses, right? We have requirements on endpoint controls, on security programs. We really couldn't do that very effectively if you were relying on this vendor. One thing that really jumped out was a grocery chain in Sweden, of all places, that was using this software and was down permanently at 800 stores. I mean, this was an apocalypse event for them, right? So all because the vendor that they trusted weren't keeping up with their security responsibilities. Another one that I thought was interesting, Volkswagen US, which includes Audi, as I learned, was using an outside company for some marketing purposes. Nothing all that essential, right? Marketing. Everyone uses marketing software and all these marketing providers out there. This went on for 5 or 6 years. Turns out that that company had been storing some of the data in an unsecured, internet accessible location. It was just a matter of time until it was found. And after it was found, it went on for years longer before it was detected. So from 2019 through 2021, some attackers had access to a lot of Volkswagen data through their third-party marketing vendor. Over 3 million individuals who were impacted by this. Many of them not even customers of Volkswagen, people who had inquired about certain items. But among that 3 million, 90,000 were social securities, loan numbers, everything involved with that, which caused obviously a huge impact for Volkswagen themselves. None of these people who were the affected individuals, whether it's the Kaseya incident or the Volkswagen incident, none of the end users are saying, I can't believe Kaseya did that to me, or I can't believe this marketing vendor did that to me. The fault lies with the person you do business with, in this case, Volkswagen. Who's angry? Who are they angry at? It's Volkswagen. So we as organizations obviously have a huge reason to outsource certain functions to vendors. We want to stick to our core competencies. We want to do what we do. We don't want to have to worry about managing a data center. We don't want to have to be experts on customer relationship management software. We want to go to other experts who provide that to us. But those relationships present innumerable risks to us. Okay, I gave you 2 examples, and we could spend the rest of the hour and probably the rest of the afternoon giving more. But what could happen based on our relationship with the vendor? It could be as simple as you chose the wrong vendor and they can't service you in the way that you need them to. There could be the classic example of a data breach, right? That's pretty simple and straightforward, but a lot of other things could happen. You might have concerns with their availability. If the vendor goes down, you go down. You might have regulatory concerns. If you need to adhere to GLIBA or FERPA or HIPAA or any other requirements, then the vendor must also need to adhere to them. And what happens if they don't, right? What if they put the software forth for you that's buggy and is not working as well as you would expect it to, and your customers see that, and that causes challenges for them? What if there's actual financial errors? A multitude of things that could go wrong, that go far beyond what many people think of when we initially think of vendor risk. Sometimes it starts and stops with the availability of the vendor and their criticality. Other times it starts and stops with simply the accuracy and completeness of the transactions they process for you, or how well they protect your client data. So there's a number of things that could go wrong, and we really need to, up front in the vendor management process, identify what those items are. Not just criticality, not just data security, but all the things that could go wrong and all the impacts that could fall back on us as the subscribing organization or the user entity of those services, and figure out how to control those. And it all comes down to this right here at the slide: is functions can be outsourced, but at the end of the day, responsibility cannot. So let's talk about what those fundamentals are. What kinds of things do we actually recommend doing within a vendor management program that can help you to identify the risks, the problems, and the controls and reviews and tasks in place that might mitigate those? There are a lot of different vendor management paradigms, third-party risk management paradigms out there. Many organizations will subscribe to certain regulatory environments that will prescribe them to you, but most of them are going to follow a very similar function to what you're seeing here. The four main elements to third-party risk management in most organizations are, as you see, starting off with a risk assessment, getting your arms around what you have. Due diligence, which is typically upfront due diligence of any sort of third party before they can be onboarded into your systems. The contract that you have with them itself, and then an ongoing monitoring program, which is similar to due diligence, but continues to go on over time. So we're going to dive into each of those areas a little bit. And again, if there are questions that come up, feel free to ask them. I do see that there's one question, which hopefully we'll be able to answer live, but Andy, if you have any further questions, please do jump in. So let's start with the risk assessment. Risk assessment is boring. I understand it. Everyone is probably swimming in risk assessments on this call. And we always talk about your IT risk assessment, your vendor risk assessment, your information security risk assessment, your business continuity risk assessment, and on ad nauseum. But this one is truly important and fundamental to a vendor management or third-party management program. That complete inventory is the most important part of it, right? Because you're going to have more than likely hundreds of vendors involved at a minimum. If you're a larger, more complex organization, you could have 1,000 or more easily that are third parties to your organization. Many of them will be relatively insignificant. I appreciate that. So they're not all created equal. So it is still important for us, though, to at least get our arms around that and systematically determine which of those hundreds of vendors are critical, which are high risk, which are low risk, which are somewhere in the middle. You can't skip that step. Okay, we see often vendor management or third-party management programs that come from a presumption of which vendors are critical. Those are the ones then that we're going to risk assess, and those are the ones that are going to go through our due diligence programs. But how did you even determine that in the first place? And how did you know that somewhere else in the organization there isn't a vendor doing something that you didn't realize, that you weren't aware of? This problem gets complicated even further with the dreaded shadow IT. And you're probably all familiar with this. You probably all struggled with this a little bit. But shadow IT is when you have elements of your organization who are basically going outside of the bounds of IT management, right? You may have processes, procedures, and requirements for your vendor management program in order to be onboarded, in order to be monitored, and someone somewhere has access to a checkbook. So they say, I want to hire this accounting SaaS product to make my job a little bit easier, to automate something, or I want to bring on someone that will help manage the website. Right? Maybe those users don't appreciate the risks that could be involved with those types of relationships. So having some programs in place to clamp down on that is important. One thing that we will often see in order to get this inventory, to build your risk assessment from the ground up, is to get an export from AP. So your accounts payable system is going to be the record of all the money flowing out of your organization. Anyone who's received money over the past couple of years is likely a vendor or a third party that you should be assessing. So that's one way to clamp down on it. But you're also going to need some policies and programs on the intake going forward. Locking down the pocketbook is one way to do it. If no one can pay for a new vendor, then they're not going to come on without coming to ask you about it. That's kind of a nuclear option, but we do see that working sometimes. In any case, once you've gotten that inventory of the systems, and I do see some questions coming in that I will get to in just a second. Once you have that inventory of the systems, the first thing that you want to do is determine, is there really significance here? Okay, what would indicate some significant relationship that would then need a full risk assessment? If it's something new that you really need to assess, right, anything that you're not familiar with right now, you should be looking into. But the main criteria that we tend to consider are if they're performing any of your operational functions for you on your behalf, right? If what they do is critical to you operating as a business, they're a significant relationship, no question. The data sensitivity piece of it, if they have access to sensitive data, they're almost certainly going to be a significant relationship that needs to be assessed, and we'll have some risk involved there. I labeled some types of data that would certainly fall into that category. If this one sometimes gets overlooked, but if they're marketing products or services for you, that will likely trigger some requirements around your risk assessment process. They could be exposing you to regulatory risk if they're advertising something that either doesn't meet regulatory standards or is just inaccurate, and there could be some legal jeopardy there. But that's an important one. And then, of course, the dollars and cents. Material effect on earnings or capital. Like if we can't make money without these guys, then they're certainly significant. If they're going to affect our balance sheet in a significant way, they're certainly significant. Revenues and expenses the same way. Anyone that has some level of significance out of those hundreds of vendors, if it's anything other than de minimis, if they mow the lawn for you, fine. If they're more than that, if they have some level of significance, then you really need to go to the next step forward, which is a complete risk assessment. What are we doing within this risk assessment? Okay, you need to identify the different dimensions of risks that they could present to you. And when I say the dimensions of risk they present to you, I mean that specifically. You and this vendor, your specific relationship. Because the vendor could have a different type of relationship with a different organization. And there could be different risks involved with that particular relationship. But for you, it could be different. It could be more substantial to you, more material to the size of your business. There could be different contractual pieces in place. There could be different modules that the vendor uses. So what we're really looking at is not just an in a vacuum assessment of the vendor. We're assessing the relationship that you have with that vendor. And they could present all these different types of risks to you: strategic risk, reputation risk, transaction risk, compliance risk. Kind of go back to those examples early on that we discussed and think about, use your imagination. What could go wrong and what's going to happen to us if it does in fact go wrong? Right? Sometimes we see vendor risk assessments or something akin to a risk assessment that really just assesses what they call criticality of the vendor. And that tends to mean operational risk. Right? If this vendor weren't here, how big a deal would that be for us? Right? Could we continue to operate? Right? Would we be able to replace them quickly? But that doesn't necessarily get you to understanding reputation risk or financial risk or credit risk they might expose you to, a lot of different things. And sometimes we also see them focusing purely on data security and privacy. The point here is you really need to expand it further than that. And I would also suggest that rating a vendor as high, moderate, or low risk, or maybe use a 5-point scale instead of a 3-point scale, but just calling the vendor as a whole, high risk, moderate risk, or low risk, might not give you the full picture of the risks that they're exposing you to, because it may matter to your third-party management program whether it's an operational risk or a data privacy risk or a financial risk, because those could have different follow-ons on what you need to do as a result. We have had a couple people ask about recommendations for tools to manage the vendor management program for you, or to go out and actually look for the inventory of systems that are within your network. There's certainly some out there. Actually, there's quite a few vendor management tools. And one thing that certainly Wolf makes available is Wolfpack. Some of you may be familiar with that. We have a software that we make. And within that software is specifically a vendor management module, which I would obviously recommend checking out. But other things that you can look through, there's a number of software solutions out there that will essentially organize your vendors that you have contracted with and sort out the dates of when those contracts need to be looked at and the tasks that need to be done for each vendor as part of the either due diligence or ongoing monitoring piece of it. So they'll usually have that all encapsulated with assignments to ping people for when those tasks are due. Another thing that may be built in that you may be interested in is not only a tool to help you manage your program, but a tool to go out and on your behalf perform some due diligence on these vendors. Okay, that's a very interesting business model that we're seeing more of. It's certainly helpful. So I would say take it for what it's worth. This is someone's opinion that this vendor is secure or insecure, or that there's certain risk there, or that this SOC is in place. But at the end of the day, if you're going to use one of those systems, remember that you still own the risk. No matter what, you own the risk, and someone's opinion is just that. You own the risk, you own the decision. So don't just rely on someone else's input and run with it. Make sure that you're the one making the decision and doing so consciously. All right, I'll continue moving on here to try and get through the content. Beyond the risk assessment, which is a huge effort in and of itself, but let's say we've got the risk assessment down. Now we know what the vendors are that present certain risks to us. We can say that these are vendors with a high data security risk, these are vendors with a high operational risk, and so forth. The due diligence that then should be following on to those vendors ideally has two criteria. One is that it happens prior to anyone signing anything. Always need to make sure that you're having this done in a time when you have influence over it. Once the contract is signed, it's nearly impossible to get anything out of them, right? Your negotiating leverage is gone. So if they have a problem that comes to light, you want to know that before anything gets signed. Okay? But the other most important thing to understand here is that the specific tasks you execute ideally should match up against the risks that you identified. So if you identified risks related to data security and privacy, you should be looking at maybe a SOC report with the confidentiality and security principles in scope. If you had risks related to financial transaction processing, maybe you're looking for a SOC 1, or maybe you need PCI compliance, right? So it's not one size fits all. One high-risk vendor may have very different risks than another high-risk vendor, as I mentioned. So the tasks themselves should be suited to the specific risks that you identify. In reality, I understand that this is very, very hard to do. Very hard to do that, and time-consuming to lay them out that way. If you can do it, then kudos to you. If you can't do that, then what most end up falling back on is a more simple tiered system. All low risk vendors get the following 2 items. All moderate risk vendors get those 2 plus an additional 4. And all high risk vendors get those 6 plus an additional 5, right? So it's just sort of a tiered structure based on risk. But to the greater extent that you can align them with the real risks and not just the overall risk rating, the better you'll do here. A couple things to think about is what type of evidence are you actually receiving from them? And there's a very different level of assurance that you're going to get from a self-assessment questionnaire, or a DDQ that you put out there, versus actually going out and auditing them directly yourself, or looking at an independent audit report or a certification. Those are all things that are going to give you varying levels of comfort. And based on the risks that you identify, you're going to have to determine what's adequate based on your risk tolerance. When you do get those items, make sure that the key to this is action. So if anything comes back on them, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to receive the SOC report, see that it's qualified or has exceptions, and check it off and file it away and proceed? Or are you going to take some action on it? Right? And that last bullet point is what's often missing from these programs. Just make sure that whatever data you're receiving, you can make any management decision you want on it. All right. So from an audit perspective, I try not to tell management what decisions to make, but I do want to be very sure that they're making fully informed, data-informed decisions, right? You get the information, you appreciate what it means to you, you appreciate how it aligns with your risk tolerances and your risk strategies, and then you make a decision. Your decision could be to accept those risks. It could be to forget these guys, we're not going with them, or it could be to work with them somewhere in between. It could be that there's mitigating controls you can put in on your environment, such as they're going to be in a more secure network and you're going to have more proactive constant management over them. It could be that you're just going to give them a timeline to remediate the items and they'll be on sort of probation until then. There are a number of things that you can do. We have a question. As a vendor, at times, a few customers asking the vendor about what data processes and how the system is used by the vendor. Quite flawed in the assessment to me. The customer asking about what data the vendor process, how the system is used. Okay, so the customer may be asking the vendor what data is used. I think I'm understanding it that the customer should already know that, or the customer has an appreciation of which data that they're using. I'm not sure the flaw there, so maybe if you could clarify that, I'll get it back. But certainly what the customer should be asking is, if I'm to provide you this data, what controls and processes do you have in place to protect it? And what sort of privacy and confidentiality controls do you have in place over the data? They don't necessarily need to get to the details of your processes, but as it relates to the use of the client's data that they're giving to you, that's something that they're going to want to learn about. And depending again on what you do and what kind of data you deal with, what they're learning from you should come in the form of a SOC report or some type of attestation from an independent party. It's not always possible, and certainly can be challenging in some cases, but that's what I would expect, from the evaluator, the customer in that situation. Hopefully I answered the question. If not, please do resubmit and clarify, and I'll be happy to get back to it. All right, let's continue forward then. A few other items. We're going to move on to contract structuring right now. Contract structuring is critical to managing your vendors, okay? But I like to throw in a pretty strong caveat here that while contracts are important, they are not controls really in and of themselves, okay? It's not due diligence, it's not monitoring, it's not really preventing anything from happening. Contracts mostly will just help you recover some money after things go wrong, right? So we definitely recommend the belt and suspenders approach. Okay, you want to have a lot of actual controls and monitoring and oversight in place, but to the extent that you're able, enforce those controls and those provisions within the contract itself. Get as much of it in writing as you possibly can, so that there's really no question that yes, they need to allow you to come in and audit this data, right? Or they need to provide you with a certain item. The other thing that you want to keep in mind with contracts is that it's easy for them to get lost. It's easy for people to forget about it. You want to make sure that these are, that you can find them, that they're in a centralized location, and that they're all being managed. This should go through one of those vendor management programs that I talked about before, but there are some critical dates to remember as well. This isn't necessarily security focused, but just hygiene and good operation with your vendor program to keep track of the dates. When did the contract originate? When is it going to expire? Based on those two dates, when is vendor notification required? Sometimes you need to give them 1 month or 3 months notice. So we're moving backwards from that expiration date. If you need to give them 2 months notice, when do we need to start our internal review processes to hit that date? Probably at least a couple of months in advance of that. And that varies with the size of the contract. So build out all these dates and work backwards from the expiration, because very often we see these auto-renewing contracts that leave you on the hook for another year or 3 years because someone wasn't on the ball in organizing it and tracking those contracts. Now, what the contract should actually contain, certainly for high-risk vendors of almost any risk dimension, you're going to want a legal review of those contracts. Might not always be required for small fees or no significant risk presented, but there are a few things that definitely should be included. You're going to want to look for all of these particular items here within the contract. It takes two to tango. You can't unilaterally enforce anything in these contracts, but you do have some negotiating leverage when you are dealing with the vendor, certainly when it's a prospect. You can get as many of these requirements in as you can. Just like any other due diligence act, if it comes back and there are questions or concerns, you don't like this particular item within the contract, it's a data point, right? Think of it like a deficiency. Is there something else that we need to do with it, or can we live with it, or do we need to walk away? Right, so make those decisions based on what can and can't go into the contract. Some other things I didn't list here, but you may want to think about, is having a requirement to produce all of those due diligence artifacts and ongoing monitoring artifacts. Depending on what they're doing for you, you could certainly require them to be duly licensed for whatever it is that they're doing. That is mostly relevant to professional services. Anything related to business continuity and incident response, and in particular, breach notification. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but notification of breaches, that will often be in the contracts under confidentiality. But whatever is in the contract, whatever makes its way into the contract, you want to be very sure that it aligns with your own incident response procedures and business continuity procedures, that there's congruence between the two. If the vendor has a timeline to notify you or a timeline to cure that's longer than your timeline for notifying your customers, it can get very hairy about who told who and when do you need to notify, and that's something you want to avoid. Get that in the contract right up front. Similar subcontracting relationships should be in here whenever possible or whenever relevant. Certainly if there's anything related to foreign-based subcontracting or restrictions of foreign storage of data, all those things can make their way into the contract in addition to being part of your due diligence and part of your ongoing monitoring. All right, we do have a question based on how, yes, so as you said, don't wait until it's ready for review to start researching alternatives. You work backwards, as you said, don't wait till the review time is there. Work backwards based on the renewal notification, work backwards further from there for your internal monitoring piece of it. Now, based on how organizations does classifications should determine what types of review are done. I certainly agree with that. If we go back here, the review is probably only need to go to your legal department if it's a higher risk vendor. It depends on your risk tolerances. Many lower risk vendors may have a lesser requirement for the type of review that they go through in their contracts. But yeah, the frequency that they're reviewed, certainly at every contract renewal, it should be re-reviewed. And the depth and the individuals involved with the review are going to fall from the risk assessment, as does almost everything that we're discussing here follows from the risk assessment. Okay, the last piece I want to talk about and the fundamentals here is the ongoing monitoring of the vendor. Now, this is very, very similar to the due diligence process. Okay, and oftentimes the two terms are used interchangeably. You've got due diligence, you've got ongoing monitoring. Okay, but due diligence, at least in the way that I'm discussing it today, is the upfront. Okay, this is it's a point in time before we're going to sign on the dotted line. That doesn't last forever. Third-party risk management is an ongoing process. It needs to be continually monitored. And why? Because risks change over time. It could be that your own risks change during that time. External events or internal events could change your risk profile, could change your risk tolerance and your risk appetite. So your expectations and your requirements may change. On the third party side, their controls may change. And not only might their controls change and your risks and requirements change, but the nature of your relationship can also change over time. They could have new modules added on. They could have new things that they're starting to do for you that they didn't do originally. They could have been bought out. They could have replaced the key stakeholders on their end that were servicing you. So this really needs to be an ongoing process. And I would say at a minimal annually for pretty much all vendors. That being said, both the frequency and the intensity of this ongoing monitoring should be a function of that vendor risk assessment. So your TPRM should define, based on vendor risks, how often we're going to perform ongoing monitoring over these vendors and what specifically falls under the that ongoing monitoring of the particular vendor. As with the due diligence, the best way to do this is to do it on a per vendor basis based on those specific risks. Difficult to do. That's an ideal world. It is difficult to do, but the fallback again is to have sort of templates. The same thing that we were talking about before. Low risk vendors will get a certain number of tasks. Moderate risks will get more. High risks will get more. But to the extent that you can, strongly recommend looking at the, are they presenting to you operational business continuity risks, or are they presenting to you financial risks or data security risks or something else, and customizing the monitoring tasks to meet those risks? It's the best way to do it. Okay, now what does it probably look like? When you look at the risks of your vendors, they can't all be equal. Okay, we have sometimes our clients will tell us we consider everything high risk, so we're going to do everything for everyone, which I'd never believe for many reasons. One, you're not doing everything for everyone. I guarantee you're not. But two, if you are, then you're wasting time. Okay, you shouldn't be reviewing the lawnmower the same way that you do your main CRM SaaS provider. It doesn't make any sense. So what we most often see is some array of vendor risks that look kind of like the pie chart over here. You know, you're going to get your top 10% of the vendors that are truly high risk and critical and need a special focus on them. You're going to get a large chunk of the rest that are somewhere in the middle, and then some low risk vendors that you don't really have to spend a lot of time on. That's a 3-point scale, very, very basic. You can get to 5-point, you can get to 7-point. Some people have a 1 through 100. It gets very complex. I think once you start to get too quantitative and numerical, you can start to lose the plot a little bit. You can, lose the forest for the trees. But whatever your program is, you want to make sure that you're using the full scale, all the way from low to high, or all the way from 0 to 100, so that you're really truly assessing the vendors using that scale. And once it's done, you're going to have these low, moderate, and high risk review tasks, plus ideally some kind of customized tasks based on certain vendors, maybe certain high risk vendors, and what specifically they're doing for you. Here, okay. What do these monitoring activities actually entail? There's a ton that might fall into the ongoing monitoring category. Probably the most basic thing that you should be doing is getting, certainly for high risk vendors here, getting independent controls reports and or certifications. Okay, so this is not a questionnaire that they have to fill out. This is someone coming in and proving to you that they're actually doing the things they're supposed to be doing. SOC reports are probably the most common for that. High trust, very common in the healthcare industry. ISO 27001, there's PCI certification, there's CMMC certification, there's a number of certifications out there. But those are probably the most common and most fundamental things that you should be getting here. If there are regulatory exams, get those. If they're a going concern, take a look at their financial condition. You might want to get their BCP, or at least some summary of it, to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Review the contract on a regular basis. Review the SLAs on a regular basis, make sure that they're meeting those, right? So this is just a small sampling of things that you may do. Once again, the most important piece of this is that you're taking some action on it. So if anything comes out of it, there's information within the SOC report that could be potentially concerning to you. What are you going to do about it? Prove that you've identified it. You're making that data known to you and the organization, and you're making a risk-informed decision based on it. I'm not going to tell you that you can't do business with a vendor who had an exception in their SOC report, right? There's usually an exception in the SOC report. Often enough, there's a qualification of some sort in the SOC report, but you just need to know that, understand it, and then proceed accordingly based on your program and your risk tolerances. Put a bunch of other things here that may fall under the ongoing monitoring program. This is almost endless, right? This is a non-exhaustive list, but based on the risks that you've identified with them, some of these items may go into the task list. Other things may go into the task list, right? This is just a list of examples here, and we'll send the slides out for your information so you see this, but just things to think about. Don't stick with just the basics here. Go further and figure out what else might we be doing to mitigate these specific risks. Okay. One thing that always comes up in these questions is, what about subcontractors? What about the third parties to the third parties? This is not an easy question to answer, but I will say in most cases, you're not expected or required to go down that rabbit hole, because you could go to fourth parties and fifth parties and sixth parties. If there's a reason to, and you want to directly audit or assess the subcontractor or the fourth party, certainly you can. Okay, you can make that request. But for the most part, if the third party that you're doing business with has a reasonably mature security program, or if they've gotten any sort of independent audit program that comes through for them, that will include their own assessment of their third parties. Okay, so there's sort of a transitive process, right? I review the vendor to make sure they have a vendor management program. Those vendors then have to have a vendor management program and so on and so forth. But again, if you want to, for a particular reason, you certainly can. If the SOC report has a carve out, and we don't believe that the carved out service provider has their own SOC report, or that you have reason to doubt them, then you could ask to go further and audit that fourth party yourself. Maybe they're just so important and so fundamental to you that you want, for your own peace of mind, you want to go do it. You can do that. Nothing's stopping you. Just, it's not always required unless you have a reason to. We have one more question that I missed. Is, do you recommend asking vendors for customer contacts? This would be, I believe, in the due diligence process when we're talking about, what risks do they present to us and how might we get assurance over that. If you mean customer contacts, then as in referrals, references or referrals, then yes, that's very common. You want to talk to other people they've done business with and get assurance that way. It's a common thing to do. I think there's value in it. And I would recommend doing that for anything that reaches a certain threshold. Hopefully that answers the question. We have another question. Who should be performing ongoing monitoring tasks? Okay, centralized versus decentralized. We see this working both ways. And I see it working effectively both ways. That being said, the decentralized model is probably prone to more risk on your part. Okay, if the vendor owner doesn't have a great understanding of your security program, and train and educate as you might, honestly, they probably don't, right? If it's someone in the accounting group or the marketing group or wherever, IT and security is not really their business. So they might not have an appreciation for the things they should be looking for. I think the best way to lay this out, just in my opinion, is yes, you want to have vendor owners or vendor sponsors, and they're going to, at the end of the day, own the relationship. They're going to be probably completing the risk side of your risk assessment, if not the controls side, with input from the security office, a centralized security office, to review it and make sure. But the actual due diligence monitoring is most effective, I think, in a centralized environment, just because you have people who really know what they're looking for and are intimately familiar with your risk program as a whole. So you're more likely to see something that triggers action for you. Whereas if you push that to the vendor owner and only ask for an executive summary from them, you might miss important data along the way. Can work both ways, and it depends on the level of maturity and familiarity throughout the organization. But I do think you get a little bit more value with the controls review, the due diligence and ongoing monitoring occurring within a centralized environment. Okay. All right, I'm going to, we do have some, we're coming up on time, so I want to move through the rest of this fairly quickly, but then I'll try to address questions towards the end here. So just quickly, a couple things that we often see going wrong in the vendor due diligence process. Well, I was just kind of talking about this a second ago, right? The risk assessment completeness and accuracy. Oftentimes, the inventory that you're starting from is just wrong. Okay, you might have service providers who aren't included in the risk assessment for one reason or another. You may have service providers who you haven't used in years, who are still being reported and assessed in here. Right, so make sure that that's cleaned up. We see a lot of basically data quality issues in risk assessments for not being maintained in the inventory side of it. Making sure that you have processes and procedures in place that if you bring on a new vendor relationship or terminate a vendor relationship, that you're updating the risk assessment accordingly and periodically reconciling it. Also keep in mind that the third-party risk assessment is not the same as your IT risk assessment or your InfoSec risk assessment. It's its own standalone thing. There's relations there, but it is a standalone. I also had mentioned this one too, but very commonly we see business continuity and incident response capabilities that do not align with your organization's requirements. You have a contract or an SLA that requires them to have certain uptime or certain response time, and that is not sufficient for your own internal requirements. Now, that's going to become a problem eventually. So identify that right up front and get ahead of that. Subcontracting arrangements can cause a problem here, particularly if you have requirements around foreign-based vendors or foreign-based data storage. So identify that in your contract and make sure you continue to ask and monitor about it. And SOC reports. SOC reports, we could have a whole hour on reviewing SOC reports very easily, but in one slide, make sure you're getting these when they're released as timely as you can. Doing the review once a year, looking back over what could be almost 2-year-old data is not that helpful. Making sure you're looking at the correct SOC reports. I've seen many organizations review the wrong SOC reports, right? A vendor might have 3 or 4 SOC reports that they put out for their various products. Make sure you're getting the right one. Make sure that you're evaluating deficiencies, whether they're qualified or not. Making sure that you're looking at those complementary user entity controls, things they say you're responsible for, and validating that they are in fact implemented, following up on them. Definitely recommend having a guide of some sort, a form, a checklist, whatever, but don't just check the boxes, actually read the report and understand what it means to you as a business. We're going a couple of minutes late here, so very, very quickly on the tech innovator side. There's a ton of use cases, okay? Everyone is doing everything with technology now. Right here in Boston, it's exciting because we have so many startup incubators and everything going on that presents all these cool new technologies to you and these capabilities and innovative types of programs to you. There's endless use cases, right? But the problems are that many of these companies are less mature in their risk management structure. Okay, often there'll be 4 people in the company, right? They're obviously not going to have the same type of security program that a 1,000-person company does. They might not be able to give you a certain level of assurance. They might not be familiar with certain regulatory items. And frankly, there can be a culture clash between a startup whose entire business for the past couple of years has been get product to market versus someone who works in a bank or a hospital or an insurance company who has very strong security and risk requirements, right? That can be a hurdle to overcome. I would say do not reduce your requirements. We should find a way to work with them, but it shouldn't be through just throwing away your program. Run them through the processes with all the usual rigor and find out what all those gaps are. Identify it and then make decisions based on it, just like you would. Maybe your risk appetite is such that this is a really important strategic venture for you. You're going with it, okay? But at least know what the risks are before you make that decision, okay? And then you might be able to do something about it. There are mitigations you might be able to put in place. There are other strategies you might be able to put in place. Maybe you give them a timeline. Maybe you say you don't have this certification yet, but you need to within 6 months or the contract is done. And maybe you can go audit them yourself. One interesting strategy we've seen is to actually help them. So if you're a bank, for example, you have a lot of regulatory compliance expertise in-house that they may not, and they may need some help getting there, and there can be more of a partnership in that regard than just a pure customer and service provider relationship. A few other things to just put in some control mitigations. We have seen people as well introduce some middleware into the process to insulate your systems from the vendor if you don't have a strong warm and fuzzy about their security environment, right? If you don't want to connect them directly to your systems, there could be some middleware or some intermediaries in some form that you can put into place there and have better control along the way. So I know we rushed through those last few, but again, the slides will be available. And at this point, I do want to open it up to questions that anyone else may not have asked, and we'll try to get to them.
So Ryan, we have Andy Chandler asked a question at the very beginning. I'm not sure if you could see that in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I could read it off to you.
Yeah. I see the question. So these third-party issues are serious. Would a vendor due diligence review catch these issues? Look at what happened with LastPass. So standard review may not have caught the weakness that leads to the incident. So it's a fair point that no vendor review or third-party review can catch everything. No audit can catch everything. No penetration test can catch everything, right? No control structure that we put in place can catch everything. But certainly with the understanding that nothing is foolproof and there's no such thing as 100% in this business, you can catch the easier questions, right? You can identify what would be sort of a gaping hole and avoid that. And hopefully, when you're looking at organizations that are maybe in the middle between totally immature and very mature, you can identify opportunities to improve their maturity level, right? You need to get this type of, you need to put in a better asset management program into your environment. I want to see patch management and vulnerability management and penetration tests as a fundamental part of your controls on a monthly basis, right? Those types of things present opportunities to not eliminate, but to reduce the risk that something terrible could happen on the vendor's side.
Thanks, Ryan. And then the next question is from Caitlin.
How do you inventory freeware and get business units to tell us what they use for freeware? So I said that restricting the purse strings is the best way to prevent shadow IT. That's tough if they don't have to pay for it. So if elements of your organization are using pieces of software that they were able to just download and install themselves, that's maybe a problem in and of itself, right? Ideally, we want to see the ability to download, or certainly to install, any sort of software restricted to administrative users. If your IT admins are bypassing your controls, so that's another level of control problem that hopefully an audit identifies. But let's say that we have them out there. Maybe someone is using a purely SaaS-based product that is free, that you didn't know about. That one is very, very hard to identify. But if it's something that lives on your network, there are many tools that are either free or very reasonably cost that can scan your network to identify what's installed on every system, right? And once you start to build out your asset inventory, and by asset inventory, I mean both hardware and software, you've got your standards of what we expect to see everywhere. We knock those all off, and then we start seeing the delta. What appeared on this department's computers that wasn't elsewhere? What was on this particular user's computer that wasn't elsewhere? And you can start to investigate those. It's a huge effort to try and track things down manually that way. Not easy to do, and it needs to be an ongoing process. But just like when people implement a vulnerability management system, it's a huge effort to get it down to only those few newly released patches and vulnerabilities. But once you're there, it's a maintenance issue. It becomes much easier to stay ahead of once you've gotten there in the first place. And the same can be said about your fourth party asset list, so essentially.
Thanks, Ryan. And Tom Hart had pointed out fairly enough that most open source code does not have a warranty. So that is a good point, Tom. Thanks for that. The next question was, if the third party fourth to your organization, Ryan, is performing a key part, e.g. hosting, would you not be required to assess them?
So hopefully, if let's say you're contracting with a SaaS provider, and that SaaS provider hosts everything within AWS. Very common situation right now. In fact, probably more common than any other situation. That laps the field. I don't think that you as an organization need to go directly audit Amazon Web Services. Okay? You can, if you want, get AWS's SOC report or their other due diligence materials they make available. But the vendor that you're using should have done that already. And if you're getting your own vendor or third party's SOC report, I'm using SOC report as an example because one of the requirements for getting a SOC report at all is to have a strong vendor management program in place. So you can be assured that if they have a SOC report they can give to you, then their vendors, your fourth parties, have given a SOC report to them. Couple of exceptions that I would call out here. If the hosting site, the data center, the cloud, whatever it is not Amazon, if it's someone you've never heard of, and you don't think that they have a SOC report available, or you want to get that SOC report yourself, then I would definitely recommend taking that extra step to get the level of assurance over the data center hosts themselves. But that's a question that you may want to ask your third party to dive into that, pull the thread a little bit, and figure out if you need to take that extra step.
Thanks, Ryan. And Danielle asked a similar question. Would it be appropriate to obtain a bridging letter from the third party of the SOC report if it does not cover the same period as your own fiscal period, i.e. a full 12-month calendar year?
Yeah, bridging letters are interesting. So this is really specific to SOC 1s usually. This goes back to the SAS 70 days. So the SAS 70, those of us who remember it, would cover a period, say October through September. The report would get released sometime around December, maybe January, and your fiscal year goes through December 31st. So you've got a gap from October 1st through December 31st where the report doesn't cover your period. A bridge letter then would say, nothing's changed, the controls will continue to operate, trust it. That bridge letter comes from the vendor, doesn't come from the auditor. It's not reviewed by the auditor expresses no opinion on it. So it's not really much better than a pinky promise, in my opinion. I know that us as auditors on the financial side often ask for it, But from purely a vendor management, third-party risk management standpoint, it's not providing you a lot of value. I think what's more effective is to align your vendor management program so that you know when these SOC reports are going to be released, or whatever other report you're relying on. Know when it's going to be released. It's usually the same time every year, and be prepared to ask for it around that time. That way you're getting the most up-to-date information. The worst thing that I see happen is sometimes people will do all of their vendor management in April. Come April, we're going to spend a week reviewing every SOC report and getting it all done in the first week of April. But maybe one of your vendors has a SOC report that runs through February 28th of every year. And that report becomes available at the end of April or the beginning of May every year. By the time you're receiving that report to review in April, the report is already 10 plus months stale. And it's looking back another 12 months beyond that. So you're about 2 years out of date by that point. So that's not an effective program. I think just knowing when they're coming out and being prepared to review them at that time is the best that you can do.
Thanks, Ryan. And similar to that, Maria Isabel asked, do you know if AWS partners would be normally reviewing AWS SOC reports as part of their quote vendor management process?
They should be, right? So if certainly not every AWS customer is, but if they're producing a SOC report and they use AWS, then they would have had to get that AWS SOC report. Again, if they're not giving you a SOC report, then you should have a lot more questions to pull the thread on there.
Sure.
I guess I'm less concerned with AWS. I shouldn't be. I know this is not the official answer, but the honest answer is I'm less concerned with Amazon than I am with a local provider that you may not be quite as familiar with or have as much trust in. Only because there's already 10,000 other organizations looking at Amazon's SOC report.
Gotcha. Thanks, Ryan. And Sonoj had noted a question: what lesson is learned from the SVB incident, especially when we deal with new technology vendors? How do we ensure those vendors are financially solvent?
Ooh, so the SVB incident is probably going to go a little above my pay grade. I know we could bring in our financial institutions head to talk a little bit more about that, but a classic bank run is what we had there. And they had some issues underlying to begin with. If you're concerned about essentially the financial solvency of the organization, right, we need to make sure that they're going concern. This is probably related to two concerns. One is you can't replace them immediately and they're critical to your ongoing operations. Or it could be that you're concerned they're about to go out of business. They might do something unethical, with your systems or data. What you look for there is a review of their financial condition. Right? I can't review that and tell you anything useful about it, but your accounting department probably can. So what we sometimes see is that the vendor management office will kick if it's a publicly traded company, the financial statements to the accounting department to review. Tell us if there's any red flags here. We don't always know. SVB didn't necessarily have any red flags, but such is life, right? That's a risk that we all take. So again, nothing's going to be 100%.
Thanks, Ryan. And Tom Hart chimed in with a good point. If ever in doubt, something that Tom does, he asks for a cyber security policy rider just for the organization as an additional piece of assurance. Other than that, Ryan, I don't see any brand new questions. I appreciate the folks who have stayed on here for a couple extra minutes on top of the regular hour. As I mentioned, we'll make this recording available to Wolf & Company's YouTube website in the near future, and we'll make sure to send through the presentation deck. Christo and I had pinged a Google link below if you folks could kindly reply with any and all feedback you have for us to improve these joint webinar sessions in the future. Otherwise, Ryan, sincerely appreciate your time and perspective, and thank you the other folks here that have joined. I guess Trevor had one question he snuck in before the bell. Could you suggest any best practices to ensure understanding and buy-in related to the required CUEC controls? Do you typically see a documented control to evidence the review and sign off of those complementary user entity controls?
Yes, good question. And yes, I do typically ask for that type of a review. The danger here is someone will get the SOC report, they will look at the page of the CUEC, put a check on it, and move on with their day. As an auditor, that doesn't tell me a whole lot, right? That doesn't give me a lot of assurance that these things are actually being done. But having a document or a form or some sort of sign off where they say, yes, we are in fact doing this, in order to notify the vendor when someone's been terminated, this is part of the HR process. We put in a ticket, and the ticket goes to these people, and then the vendor will hear about it, right? So actually being able to state, yes, we meet these CUECs, and here's how, is very powerful versus just a check mark or a sign off. It's a maturity question again, but for more mature organizations with higher risk and security requirements, I definitely recommend that type of a process.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay. So with that, I'll pause the recording, but I will keep the chat open if you folks had a chance to look at that link. Otherwise, Ryan and team, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Best of luck, and feel free to reach out with any other questions and feedback. We appreciate your time sincerely. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.